For 12 consecutive years, my husband's family took their annual holiday portrait without me in it, a tradition so consistent that by year 8, I'd simply started expecting it, quietly stepping aside every December while 20-some relatives arranged themselves in front of the same fireplace, in the same configuration, with a space that never once included me. This year, a new photographer showed up, glanced at the guest list she'd been handed, and asked a simple, direct question that undid 12 years of quiet exclusion in about 30 seconds. Wait, is this everyone? Where's Elaine Whitmore? I actually worked with her studio last year on a corporate shoot. I'd love to get her in this if she's here. 20 faces turned toward me, several of them visibly confused, because for 12 years, most of that family had genuinely stopped registering me as someone who belonged in the frame at all. If you've ever been quietly excluded so consistently that even you started to accept it as normal, stay with me, because what that photographer said next didn't just get me into a photo, it exposed exactly how long a family had been comfortable erasing me. My name is Elaine, and I married into a family with deeply established holiday traditions that had solidified over decades before I ever entered the picture, in ways that, I eventually realized, left very little natural room for a newer addition to fully integrate. My husband, Robert, comes from a large family with 5 siblings, all of whom, along with their own spouses and children, gathered every December at his parents' house for an elaborate, multi-day holiday celebration that had been running, largely unchanged, for over 3 decades by the time Robert and I got married. The centerpiece of this gathering, each year, was a formal family portrait, professionally photographed in front of the same ornate fireplace in his parents' living room, a tradition that had produced, over the decades, an entire hallway of framed photographs documenting the family's growth year over year, going back to well before Robert was even born. I want to be honest that I didn't initially register the pattern that would eventually define my relationship with this specific tradition. At our first holiday gathering as a married couple, the photograph was taken during a chaotic, crowded window of time when I happened to be in the kitchen helping Robert's mother with food preparation, and I simply assumed, that first year, that I'd been genuinely, innocently missed amid the general chaos of coordinating 20-some people into a single frame. The second year, however, I was standing directly in the living room when Robert's mother, Diane, began organizing everyone for the photo, and I distinctly remember the specific, awkward moment when she looked past me, addressing the group generally, without ever making eye contact with me directly or including me in her organizing gestures. I asked Robert about it afterward, gently, uncertain whether I was imagining a slight where none was intended. "I don't think Mom does it on purpose," he told me. In a response I would hear some version of, for the following decade, "It's just chaotic getting everyone together." I'm sure it's not personal. I wanted to believe this, genuinely, and for the first several years of our marriage, I mostly did. But the pattern persisted with a consistency that eventually became impossible to explain away as simple chaos. Year after year, as the photograph was organized, I found myself somehow always occupied elsewhere, asked to help with a task in the kitchen at exactly the relevant moment, or simply overlooked entirely as Diane arranged family members into their traditional positions that had clearly been mentally mapped out based on a family structure that, in Diane's apparent understanding, didn't quite include me as a permanent fixture. By year 5, I'd begun noticing something else troubling. Robert's siblings' spouses, who had married into the family around the same general period I had, were fully included in the photograph, standing in the frame year after year without any of the same pattern of exclusion I was experiencing. This wasn't simply a family that struggled to accommodate new spouses broadly. This was, specifically, a pattern that seemed to apply to me alone. I want to be honest about something uncomfortable because I think it matters to understanding how this pattern persisted for as long as it did. I never directly, forcefully confronted Diane about this exclusion, despite years of noticing it clearly. Part of this was Robert's consistent, if well-meaning, minimization of the pattern. His repeated insistence that it wasn't intentional made it considerably harder for me to raise the issue directly without feeling like I was manufacturing a conflict my own husband didn't seem to fully believe existed. But part of it, I think, was something more complicated within myself, a specific, quiet fear that directly naming the exclusion would force an uncomfortable confrontation I wasn't certain I had the emotional capacity to navigate, especially given how deeply entrenched Robert's family's traditions were, and how little appetite I sensed, from Robert himself, for challenging his mother directly on something he genuinely seemed to view as an innocent oversight, rather than a deliberate pattern. So I adapted, instead of confronting. By year 6 or 7, I'd essentially internalized my own exclusion, quietly finding something useful to occupy myself with each December when the photograph's organization began, sparing myself the specific, accumulating sting of watching Diane's eyes pass over me without registering my presence at all. I told myself this was simply practical self-protection, though I recognize now that it also allowed the pattern to continue entirely unchallenged for years longer than it might have otherwise. I need to explain something about my professional life here, because it becomes central to how this entire situation eventually unraveled. I run a boutique photography studio specializing in corporate and commercial photography, headshots, corporate event coverage, brand campaign imagery for mid-sized companies throughout the region. I'd built this business over roughly a decade, growing it from a solo freelance operation into a studio with 3 additional photographers working under my direction, handling a considerable volume of corporate clients throughout the area. I want to be honest that I rarely discussed the specifics of my professional life in detail with Robert's extended family, partly out of simple discretion about my own privacy, and partly, I'll admit, because the accumulated years of feeling quietly unwelcome in this family's central holiday tradition had made me generally less inclined to share much about myself at all during these gatherings, professional or otherwise. This meant that, for the better part of 12 years, most of Robert's extended family possessed only the vaguest possible understanding of what I actually did for a living, some general sense that I did something with photography, delivered with roughly the same specificity and interest that had characterized most of the family's engagement with me throughout our marriage. The year this story centers on, Diane's longtime family photographer, a man who had photographed this specific holiday portrait for nearly 2 decades, had retired earlier that year, requiring the family to find a replacement for the first time in a generation. Diane, through a referral from a friend, hired a photographer named Jessica Park, a talented, well-regarded commercial and event photographer who had built a considerable reputation throughout the region over the preceding several years. A reputation that, as it happened, included a substantial amount of corporate photography work throughout our shared metropolitan area. I want to explain the specific coincidence that unfolded next, because it's the moment this entire story pivots around. Jessica arrived at Diane's house that December, guest list in hand, prepared to organize the family's traditional portrait for the first time. As she began reviewing the names Diane had provided for context, cross-referencing who was who among the 20-some family members gathering in the living room, she reached my name on the list and paused. "Elaine Whitmore," Jessica said, looking up from her clipboard, scanning the room with genuine, professional curiosity. "Is she here? I actually collaborated with her studio last year on a corporate shoot for a client we shared. Her team does incredible work. I'd love to get her included if she's here. Is she one of the spouses?" I want to describe what happened in that living room in the several seconds following Jessica's question, because it's the moment 12 years of quiet, accumulated exclusion suddenly became impossible for anyone in that room to continue ignoring. Several family members turned toward me with expressions of genuine, visible confusion. The specific confusion of people who had, over 12 years, developed such a consistent pattern of overlooking my presence during this particular tradition that Jessica's simple, direct question about including me had apparently never occurred to any of them as something requiring active consideration. Diane, standing near the fireplace already beginning to organize the traditional positions, looked toward me with an expression I'd genuinely never seen from her before, something between surprise and a specific, uncomfortable recognition, as though Jessica's question had suddenly, involuntarily forced her to actually register a pattern she may have never consciously acknowledged, even to herself, across 12 consecutive years. "Elaine," Diane started, then paused, clearly working through something complicated in real time. "Yes, of course. Elaine's family. She should absolutely be in the photo. I want to be honest about what I felt, standing there, watching this exchange unfold. It wasn't simple satisfaction, though there was some of that present. It was something more complicated, a strange, disorienting mixture of vindication and a fresh, immediate grief about exactly how long this pattern had actually continued, entirely unchallenged, until an outside professional's simple, unprompted question finally forced the room to see it clearly. Jessica, sensing, I think, that something more significant had just unfolded than a simple scheduling clarification, glanced between Diane and me with the specific, careful attentiveness of someone who has just inadvertently stepped into a family dynamic she doesn't yet fully understand. I actually didn't realize Elaine was part of this family until I saw her name on the list, Jessica said, addressing the room generally, though I sensed she was speaking as much to smooth over an awkward moment as to genuinely explain her own connection. Her studio's done some really impressive corporate work throughout the region. I've referred clients to her team more than once. Robert's brother-in-law, a man named Curtis who I'd interacted with only sporadically over the years, turned toward me with genuine, newly curious surprise. "Wait, you run a photography studio? I don't think I ever actually knew that." "I've mentioned it," I said, keeping my voice even, though I felt the specific, complicated sting of confirming, out loud, just how little actual attention this extended family had paid to my professional life across over a decade of shared holidays. A few times, actually, Jessica proceeded to organize the group for the photograph, and I want to describe the specific, deliberate way she handled including me because it mattered considerably to how the moment ultimately felt. Rather than simply slotting me into whatever gap happened to exist at the edge of the group, Jessica took a genuinely professional, careful approach to the overall composition, asking thoughtful questions about family relationships to ensure the final image reflected an accurate, complete representation of everyone present, questions that, I noticed, several family members answered with visibly renewed attention to details about my specific relationship to Robert and to the broader family structure. Details that had apparently, across 12 years, simply never been actively considered. I stood in that photograph, for the first time in 12 years, positioned directly beside Robert, in a spot that Jessica, with her professional eye for composition, decided made the most visual sense given our relative heights and the family's overall arrangement. A spot that, I noted with some quiet, complicated emotion, had been occupied by empty space in every single photograph from the preceding 12 years. Diane approached me privately, later that evening, once the formal photography session had concluded and the family had dispersed into their usual scattered post-photo activities. "I need to say something," she said, and I could see this admission was costing her something genuine, given her usual composed, controlled manner throughout our 12 years of a relationship that had always remained carefully, if not warmly, cordial. "I think I need to actually reckon with what just happened, rather than just letting it pass as some kind of simple oversight." "I'd appreciate that," I said honestly, though I want to admit that I felt a specific wariness about where this conversation might actually land, given 12 years of Robert's own consistent minimization of the exact pattern Diane now seemed to be acknowledging directly for the first time. "I don't think I ever consciously decided to exclude you," Diane continued, her voice carrying genuine, visible discomfort. "But I also can't honestly say it was purely accidental, 12 years running. I think, somewhere along the way, I built a mental picture of this family's photograph that simply calcified around a specific configuration, and I never actually stopped to examine whether that picture still reflected who actually belonged in it. That's not an excuse. I just want you to know I'm not going to pretend this was some innocent, meaningless coincidence anymore. I want to describe Robert's response to everything that unfolded that day, because his own reckoning mattered enormously to how I processed the entire situation. Robert had witnessed the exchange with Jessica, and later, the private conversation between his mother and me, with a specific, visible discomfort that I recognized as genuine, if considerably overdue, recognition of a pattern he'd spent 12 years actively minimizing. "I think I owe you a real apology," he told me that evening, once we were back at our own house. "Not just for tonight, but for 12 years of telling you it probably wasn't intentional, without ever actually pushing my mom to examine it directly. I think it was easier for me to believe it was accidental than to actually confront what it might mean if it wasn't. Why do you think that was? I asked, genuinely curious about his own reckoning, rather than simply accepting the apology at face value. Robert thought about this for a long moment before answering. I think confronting my mom about something like this felt considerably more uncomfortable than just reassuring you. It probably didn't mean anything. And I think, if I'm honest, some part of me didn't want to consider what it might actually reveal about how my family had quietly decided to treat you, because that would have meant I needed to actually do something about it, instead of just smoothing it over every year. The months following that holiday gathering brought a gradual, genuine shift in how Robert's extended family engaged with me, beginning with a specific, deliberate effort from Diane that felt considerably more substantive than a single apology. Diane reached out directly, several weeks later, asking genuine, detailed questions about my photography business, questions reflecting actual curiosity rather than the polite, distracted courtesy that had characterized most of her engagement with me throughout our previous 12 years of a relationship. At the following year's holiday gathering, I noticed a specific, deliberate change in how the photograph was organized. Diane, working with the same photographer Jessica had recommended for the following year's session, made a point of personally ensuring I was included from the very beginning of the planning process, rather than leaving my inclusion to chance or to an outside professional's fortunate intervention. I don't think this single incident fully repaired 12 years of accumulated, quiet exclusion. Some of that specific, complicated hurt remains, and I don't think it would be honest to suggest otherwise. But something did genuinely shift, permanently, in how this family approached the specific question of who actually belonged in their central holiday tradition. I think about that photograph often, 12 years of empty space where I should have been standing, and the specific, almost accidental way an outside professional's simple question finally forced a family to confront a pattern they'd apparently never consciously examined. I don't think Diane set out 12 years ago to deliberately, maliciously exclude me from her family's central tradition. I think, more likely, an initial, genuinely accidental oversight calcified, year after year, into an unexamined habit that nobody in the family ever felt sufficiently uncomfortable to actually challenge directly, including me, for reasons I've had to sit with honestly in the time since. What I've come to understand, in the aftermath of all of this, is that patterns of exclusion don't always require active malice to persist for years. Sometimes they simply require enough people's collective willingness to avoid an uncomfortable conversation, allowing a genuinely accidental oversight to quietly solidify into something considerably more painful over time. It took an outsider, with no personal investment in the family's specific comfort, to finally ask the simple, direct question none of us had been willing to ask ourselves. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever been quietly excluded so consistently that you eventually started accepting it as normal, I want you to remember something. You deserve to occupy the space you actually belong in, without having to fight, year after year, simply to be seen. Sometimes it takes someone from outside the situation to finally ask the question everyone inside it had grown too comfortable avoiding. You're allowed to hope that question eventually gets asked, but you're also allowed to ask it yourself, sooner than I did. If this story hit home, hit subscribe, and tell me in the comments, has anyone in your life ever quietly excluded you for so long that it started to feel normal? I read every single comment, and I've got more stories like this one coming every week.